friends, it's so good to see you all, kind of, sort of, but not really. But I'm going to present to you about the relationship between the pelvic floor and gait. And what inspired me to do some research and present on this topic was that I read a study that said there is a 10 to 80% prevalence of pelvic floor dysfunction or urinary incontinence in female athletes, and especially soccer players, which I thought was really interesting, and I was really confused as to why that is, because typically associate perfect health with athletes. So let's begin. So our objectives here, we're going to review the gait cycle and review the muscle activation during the gait cycle. We're going to review some common gait deviations, go through pelvic floor anatomy and function, and explore the relationship between gait and pelvic floor most importantly. So I'm just going to do an overview of gait. So we have some terminology. So our gait cycle, it's measured from heel strike to heel strike, and we have two phases within that gait cycle. Our stance phase is the period of time when the foot is in contact with the ground, and then our swing phase is the period of time when the foot is off of the ground or accelerating the limb forward. Our stride is the distance between initial contacts of the same foot, and our step is the distance between initial contacts of the alternating foot. And gait has three main descriptors. It's described as time as a percentage, phases relative to position of the limbs, and then the weight-bearing status. So in our gait cycle, the stance phase makes about 60% of our gait cycle. We have initial contact or heel strike, and it occurs when the foot first contacts the ground, and our hip extensors are working to stabilize the hip, and we also have the quadriceps and tib anterior eccentrically contracting. We then have loading response, or our initial double limb support, so both limbs are in contact with the ground. And in this, we have the dorsiflexors contracting eccentrically, and the quads stabilizing the knee. Then we have mid-stance, or a single limb support, so only one limb is in contact with the ground. And in our mid-stance, we have the glute med and calf muscles eccentrically contracting. And then in terminal stance, this is also single limb support, so again, only one leg is in contact with the ground. And we have our toe flexors and tib posterior contracting. And then we have pre-swing, which is our second double limb support. So both limbs are in contact with the ground, and our hip flexors are propelling our limb forward. And then we move into our swing phase, which makes up about 40% of our gait cycle. And in our initial swing or our toe off, that's when our hip flexors are concentrically contracting to advance the swing leg. Then mid-swing, we have our ankle dorsiflexors for foot clearance, and then terminal swing, we have our hamstrings to decelerate the limb. And then here I have a really good visual that shows us when muscles are eccentrically contracting, concentrically contracting, or inactive, and it gives you a percentage for how much activation those muscles have in each phase of the gait cycle. And then just a brief overview of abnormal gait patterns. This is not every single abnormal gait pattern. If I did that, we would be here for a couple hours. But I'm going into the ones that are most important for the pelvic floor population and important in general. So first is antalgic gait, and it's the avoidance of weight bearing on painful structures, and it's normally characterized by a short stance phase. We can have an ataxic gait, which could be caused by cerebellar disturbances, but it's normally characterized by a wide base of support, high steps, and a foot slap. We also have a Trendelenburg gait, which is characterized by the paralysis or weakness of a glute med muscle, and it is presenting with a leaning of the trunk toward the affected side. We have a waddling gait. We see this most with a pregnant population and also with the muscular dystrophy population. And it's just an exaggerated alternation of lateral trunk movements with excessive elevation of the hip. We can also have a diplegic gait or spastic gait, which is also called a scissoring gait, which is the spasticity of the adductor muscles, and it can also present with tiptoe walking or toe dragging. And like I said, this isn't everything. These are the ones that I've seen the most with my pelvic floor patient population and the ones that I deemed most important for us to review. And then we're just going to do a brief overview of pelvic floor anatomy. I don't have a million years to talk to you about pelvic floor anatomy, even though I wish I could. But pelvic floor anatomy, we have two different layers. We have an external layer and internal layer. And our external layer is most important for sexual functioning and for sphincter control. And there's not a whole lot of differences between male and female anatomy, other than pelvic floor muscle. External pelvic floor muscles in males will go up into the shaft of the penis, and female pelvic floor muscles circle the vagina and circle the anus. Not a whole lot of differences there. But I did kind of want to mention that the pelvic floor muscles are called the pelvic diaphragm. And it's interesting to note that we also have our diaphragm that works in conjunction with our pelvic floor muscles. So it kind of creates like a dome for our diaphragm, bowl for our pelvic floor, and they have to work together. And then move into our internal layer. So these muscles are most important for stabilization, sphincter control, and holding in our internal organs. And there's not a whole lot of differences here between male and female anatomy. All these muscles kind of create like a sling around the urethra, around the vagina, and around the anus. The most important thing I would note here is that they're innervated by the S4 nerve root and the pudendal nerve. Could be important later. I don't know. And then I just have these here so we can kind of get a visual of what those muscles look like externally and as internal. And we can also see that we have muscles from the hips and the glutes in here, because we have our piriformis in the posterior portion. We have our obturator internus and externus. And then we also have a little bit of glutes that come in with our pelvic floor, and this could be important later on. Well, I guess we'll see. But we can work on pelvic floor muscles through hip muscles through overflow strength training. So kind of interesting. And most important, the function of our pelvic floor, where they support our organs, they're involved in sexual functioning, sphincter control, and core support and circulation, which is going to be our big focus on gait. So now that I talked to you about gait and pelvic floor, why do you care? Why am I still talking to you? Why are you still listening? So just to start, we're going to start ground up. So there's a lot of research on the relationship between pelvic floor and gait. And it's actually really interesting to note that foot flexibility had a relationship to urinary incontinence. A study was done that compared people that wore hiking boots or stable shoes to people that walked around barefoot. The people that walked around barefoot had more pelvic floor muscle activation than the people that had stable shoes. Kind of interesting. And it was noted that just changes in the foot kinematics can affect the hip, pelvis, and thorax, which relates to the pelvic floor musculature. There's a decrease in pelvic floor muscle activity when the ankles are plantar flexed because of the posterior pelvic tilt. When the ankles are dorsiflexed, we get an anterior pelvic tilt, and it increases that pelvic floor muscle activity, which is kind of interesting. Because when we go through our gait cycle, our initial contact or our heel strike, we're dorsiflexing the ankle, so we have an anterior pelvic tilt and increased pelvic floor muscle activity. And then later in our gait cycle, during our toe off, we have plantar flexed ankles, and we have that posterior pelvic tilt and decreased pelvic floor muscle activity. Interesting to know. There was also a couple studies about pronation and supination of the foot, but it was inconclusive. But it was shown that pelvic floor muscle activity differs between supination and pronation of the foot. And I've seen this firsthand, that with 3 of my pelvic floor patients, they all had pubic pain, urinary incontinence, and when I watched them run, they had a narrow base of support. One limb internally rotated more than the other, one limb externally rotated more than the other, and they had no heel strike. They would have a foot slap. So with them, during our treatment sessions, I worked on stretching their plantar flexors. I worked on stretching the adductors, and we worked on barefoot activities to promote heel strike. And within a couple weeks, we saw a decrease in urinary incontinence symptoms and less pubic pain. All because we looked at their feet, looked at how they run, and changed their running form, changed how they walk, and got more of a heel strike and less rotation in the limbs. Interesting to note, and I was very excited to find that there's research to support why I did what I did. And then just moving up our kinetic chain here, we have the pelvis and pelvic floor. So during gait, the pelvis rotates about 4 degrees anterior on the swing side to lengthen the limb for weight acceptance. And then with the pelvic tilt, our pelvis drops about 4 degrees on the swing side, with lowering the center of gravity at mid-stance. So with the pelvic tilt, that's where we get the activation or inactivity of the pelvic floor muscles. So that's important. And then our knee is important here as well, because our knee kind of works with our ankles. So the knee extends as the ankle plantar flexes and the foot supinates to restore the leg to original length, to reduce the fall of the pelvis at opposite heel strike. So if we're not getting knee extension, we're not getting ankle plantar flexion, and it's just going down the kinetic chain, and it can actually lead to pelvic floor dysfunction. Who would have guessed? And then we also have some lateral displacement of the pelvis. The pelvis shifts over the stance limb, and the center of gravity lies on the base of support of the stance limb. So all of our muscles are kind of working together during gait, which is why there's no surprise that pelvic floor plays a role. We just don't really have a good baseline for understanding of why pelvic floor is doing what it's doing during gait. And it's actually interesting, there were some studies that with the lateral displacement and with the rotation of the pelvis, we can actually see some asymmetries in pelvic floor muscle activity, which can lead to pelvic floor dysfunction and urinary incontinence, which is interesting. And then, like I said earlier, we have our hip muscles that kind of go into our pelvis, and we can do overflow strengthening to these hip muscles to get pelvic floor muscle strengthening, just as a little sneaky way for training. The big muscles that I would focus on for hip stabilization are the obturator and turnus, and it shares a fascial attachment with the pelvic floor muscles. And with the obturator and turnus, it's really interesting because a lot of my patients that have urinary incontinence tend to have a really, really tight obturator and turnus upon internal exam. So this is kind of the tricky muscle of like, how do we stretch it? How do we work it? How do we get it to shut up so that our pelvic floor muscles can do what they want to do? Because this muscle tends to fire, and it can look like a pelvic floor contraction, but it's just an obturator and turnus contraction, which is interesting. We also have our obturator externus on the posterior capsule for hip stabilization. And then we can't forget the most amazing part of our body, our bottoms. We have our glute max, which is important in maintaining an erect posture. And with the glute max, we also can see excessive pelvic tilting because that glute max is just doing too much. It is working too hard. And with biofeedback in my patients, I normally see that their glutes are firing more than their pelvic floor. So the glutes can kind of take over, and we lose pelvic floor muscle activation. So if you have hyperactive glutes, it's not a good thing. And then our glute med and our glute min, these muscles are important for strengthening, because if we have weak glutes, we're going to have that scissoring gait or a Trendelenburg gait. Our Trendelenburg gait, which is going to cause excessive lateral tilting of the pelvis and lead to more pelvic floor dysfunction. And then our piriformis is also important because this is a hip rotator, and it lies in the pelvis, and it can kind of create, if it's a tight muscle, it can create pain and be annoying and make the pelvic floor muscles kind of inactive, which is interesting. A lot of studies have shown if you have a tight piriformis muscle, you're going to have pelvic floor muscle dysfunction, which is interesting because who would have thought we were focusing on our butt for our pelvic floor? Not me. Piriformis is also important because it can play a role in nerve dysfunction, and if it entraps our sciatic nerve, or if the muscle's tight and is pushing on the pudendal nerve, we're going to have some problems with pelvic floor dysfunction and muscle activation of those external layer of pelvic floor muscles. And then we can't forget our core. Our core is It is the most important part of pelvic floor. It is important for gait. We need to have good rhythm with our pelvic floor, our diaphragm, our abdominals, and our low back muscles. In this GIF, you can kind of see they have to work together. When we breathe in, that diaphragm should flatten down, pelvic floor muscles should kind of relax down. And then when we breathe out, diaphragm's going to come up, pelvic floor muscles should contract up. So they need to kind of work in that rhythm, because if they're not working together, diaphragm comes down when we breathe in and pelvic floor muscles come up. That puts a lot of intra-abdominal pressure, which can cause pelvic floor dysfunction as well and increases the chance of urinary incontinence. And our core is important because it stabilizes our spine and controls the intra-abdominal pressure. And I've kind of put this in here because it's important, not really related to gait, but it's important to see that when we lift a weight, we increase our intra-abdominal pressure, and when we let a weight go, it should return to normal as long as we are breathing correctly. So breath is important. Like I said, when you breathe in, that diaphragm should flatten down, pelvic floor muscles should come down. When you breathe out, diaphragm should come up, pelvic floor muscles should come up. So with that, we want to make sure we are teaching our patients to breathe, and breathing while they're walking, while they're working, while they're doing anything. Breathing is just as important for pelvic floor. So what I'd like to tell my patients to make sure they are breathing correctly, which most of them are like, you're backwards, that's wrong, I don't know what you're talking about, you're stupid, you're bleh. Whatever. Exhale on effort. So with that, there's been studies that show that there's a link between the change in walking cadence and changes in intra-abdominal pressure. As you increase cadence or go to a faster walking speed, it increases the intra-abdominal pressure. And when you decrease that cadence and slow your walking speed, you're decreasing the intra-abdominal pressure. And they found that the reason that this is because people are not breathing as they should be when they're running. Really interesting. Who would have thought? We just need to breathe correctly. But that increase in abdominal pressure, like I said, if there's an increase in abdominal pressure, that puts a lot of stress on muscles. And if we're having a battle between our abdominal muscles, our back muscles, our diaphragm, and our pelvic floor is going to lose every single time. Something's got to give. Pelvic floor muscles got to give so we can get rid of that excessive pressure, which is going to create pelvic floor dysfunction and increase the chance of urinary incontinence. So now that I've talked to you about all these things, lectured you, talked incessantly about pelvic floor, limitations to assessing this, because obviously in the clinic we're not going to be following our patients around and trying to feel their external layer of muscles, like, hold on, let me touch your bottom so I can feel those muscles. It's not going to happen. With most of the studies I read, most of them didn't even assess pelvic floor muscles in males. It was mainly females. So there's a lot of uncertainties with this and not a lot we can do, unfortunately. We also have biofeedback that we can do, but it's not great to follow your patient around with a little tail. And they have internal probes to assess pelvic floor muscles, but they're not great with dynamic movements. But as clinicians, something we can do and something we can start to utilize in our treatments to prevent pelvic floor dysfunction, prevent urinary incontinence, mainly we can just ask questions. It's an awkward conversation to have, but to ask your patient, like, hey, have you ever had urinary incontinence symptoms? Hey, have you ever had any pelvic floor dysfunction? You'd be surprised. I know somebody who ran track in high school, and it was like a ritual, she called it. Every time after a race, she would pee her pants. And she thought it was completely normal. But that's one of those things that's absolutely not normal. And those are the questions we should be asking our patients. Hey, do you have any leaking of urine? It could be a change in our plan now because we can assess this a little bit differently. Because if we know that there is urinary incontinence, or if we know there's an increase in intra-abdominal pressure, we can definitely cue them on how to diaphragmatically breathe with any activity. With our simple sit to stand, I want you to exhale as you stand up. I want you to exhale as you sit down. Something as simple as that can actually help the pelvic floor and decrease urinary incontinence symptoms. When we're walking, make sure, are we breathing while we're walking? Make sure we're not holding our breath while we're walking. And you may not be a pelvic floor therapist, but you can still focus on strengthening of the hip and the stability of the hip. Focusing on balance can actually help pelvic floor muscle activity. If we focus on balance, we're strengthening our hip stabilizers, and that's going to help us during gait to make sure the pelvis isn't shifting excessively, and it's helping pelvic floor muscles. So just some food for thought. At this point, I would ask if we have any questions, but I can't see your questions. But here are all my resources, and I hope you enjoyed my lecture on pelvic floor and gait, and I hope you learned something. Have a good day and make good choices.